On June 25th, world leaders gathered in The Hague for the 2025 NATO Summit. As expected, allies committed to invest 5% of their annual GDPs towards defense and committed to promoting defense industrial cooperation and innovation.
We need quality and quantity. We need to innovate and we need to act fast. So we will continue our work to bring down barriers. We will leverage our partnerships with the European Union, with Ukraine, and in the Indo-Pacific to foster defense industrial cooperation.
I'm Kari Bingen, Senior Fellow in the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm pleased to welcome a terrific panel of experts to discuss the future of NATO defense, allied innovation, and battlefield learning, as well as frontline resistance. I'm joined by Kristine Berzina, Managing Director, Geostrategy North at the German Marshall Fund, Ryan Evans, CEO and founder of War on the Rocks and Bedrock Knowledge, and Zach Beecher, a partner at Scout Ventures. Last month, thanks to the German Marshall Fund, we traveled to Latvia to participate in its inaugural drone summit, visit military bases, and meet with Latvian security leaders and academics. Latvia offers a powerful exemplar, a NATO frontline country, increasing its defense investments and national resilience efforts, and fostering creative approaches to field innovative capabilities. We'll talk about our trip, the NATO Summit, and ways to enhance our collective defense through partnerships and innovation. We will take audience questions, so please submit those via the event homepage, and they'll come to me where I can direct them to the panel. So let's start with Kristine, who's joining us from Europe. Both Kristine and I were actually at the NATO Summit. So I want you to start us off with a rundown. Can you share some key takeaways? What were the atmospherics like, and perhaps what was bubbling below the surface that we haven't heard about? So Kristine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kari. I'm coming to you a day after the NATO Summit, and the atmosphere in The Hague was at first full of anticipation and fairly low expectations. There wasn't a sense that this is going to be, that there was much potential for something spectacular. And then frankly, at the end of the day, NATO and the summit and the administration over-delivered, because the amount of support that Trump expressed for the alliance, the alignment at the end of the day on 5% was everything that people had hoped for and a little bit more. There was an expectation that maybe there would still be a great deal of unhappiness, but we really didn't see that. Now the question is, what concretely comes out of it? Clearly, a US commitment to NATO and the commitment to the 5% for the alliance is a big deal. There is in the communique an announcement that and framing that Russia is a long-term threat to the alliance. In the US and US policy, the national defense strategy, Russia is often referred to as an acute threat. But the long-term framing is also an important industry signal about the fact that the need to deter and to defend against Russia is not about to go away. And so I'm quite happy about that language in the communique. And then there's the 5%. Many people are perhaps even alarmed about it. Here in Europe, we heard some pushback from youth voices that maybe that was too much. But I think what we're not hearing enough of the breakdown. 2% of that, well, 2% of those 5% are already what has been committed since 2014 in the Wales Summit. So we're talking about an additional 3% in the target over the next decade. Half of it, 1.5%, is core defense capabilities. This is what you think of in terms of missiles, guns, bullets, but also high-tech capabilities that are going to be necessary. Space could fall into that. But then 1.5% is incredibly flexible. It's defense related. Resilience and innovation fall into this category, as can Ukraine support. And there's a lot of potential in that 1.5% that I heard from senior NATO leaders, in particular as a way to motivate startup economies, as a way to create a defense industry ecosystem that would benefit both sides. And this both sides point is also really important because in the language of the declaration, there is also an effort to reduce the barriers and promote participation and cooperation across the Atlantic. The last few months have not been a moment of a lot of passion on transatlantic industry cooperation. Instead, there's distrust and suspicion. But to have something that is a transatlantic document that really talks about the need to cooperate further on the industrial side, I think is an excellent signal. So here's where a lot of the potential enthusiasm comes from. Below the surface, there's skepticism. Are countries really going to make it? It's such a long time. For some of the big countries, it's such a lot of money. Is it even necessary? All of those anxieties remain. And yet what is on paper and the alignment that we see is a tremendous step forward. And it shows a way that the alliance can be something fierce and incredible, really, in 10 years' time. And so I'm in a moment of optimism here, because there are those who might want to consider this an opportunity for creative accounting. But if you look at it not as creative accounting, but as an ability to capture enthusiasm around innovation and about a new transatlantic startup and also more widely innovative economy, there's a lot to do here.
That's a really great point. Thanks for that rundown, Kristine. And I was at the first day's NATO Summit Defense Industry Forum, and I was a bit anticipatory, wondering, is it going to be much more talk about what European industry can do and perhaps along the line of strategic autonomy, or are we going to hear about the theme of transatlantic industry cooperation? And it was very much the latter. At the NATO Summit Defense Industry Forum, the messaging from the NATO and individual leaders was, hey, tomorrow we're going to announce that 5% commitment from the allies, but industry, you need to step up and deliver. The Secretary General, his remarks were deliver, deliver, deliver. Defense industrial base, deliver on things like munitions and weapon systems. But to your point, there was quite a bit of discussion on innovation. So where can software companies and capabilities play? How do we bring more innovation into the ecosystem? And there was also a message of urgency. You know, we need to start yesterday in order to be ready and to deter. The other piece that I thought was very interesting coming out of the Defense Forum as a space person was the recognition of the importance of space, the security and economic benefits, the need to grow our collective space capabilities, the recognition of threats to those capabilities, and then the need to work together on protecting them. NATO released for the first time, a commercial space strategy, which I thought was really interesting. And so NATO is thinking through, how do we leverage these commercial capabilities? How do we better engage the private sector? And so they offered several specifics like interfaces, front doors, et cetera. How do they match problems to providers of these commercial solutions? How do they better integrate into testing and exercises? And then also share threats with these commercial operators. So I thought that was all good progress as well. Let me shift to Ryan, because I want to go back to our Latvia trip here. But I think there's a lot of connective tissue between the themes that came out at the NATO Summit and many of the themes that we talked about and observed during our trip to Latvia a few weeks ago. So drones and battlefield learning. A key reason for us visiting Latvia was to participate in this inaugural drone summit. You've visited Ukraine before. You have gained insights on battlefield trends and how the character of war is changing. You report on that. You cover it in podcasts. You have a great sense of where industry is at. Can you talk about the trends that you're seeing from the battlefield of Ukraine and what you took away from the drone summit?
Well, I think it's interesting the way Latvia is learning very deliberately from Ukraine. And I haven't been to Ukraine since pretty early in the war. So when I was there in late 2022, they hadn't yet adopted these FPV drones. So most of what I learned from the great writers that we have at War in the Rocks, people like Mike Kaufman and Dara and Dara Masico and Rob Lee and others. But I think that what we're seeing in Latvia is this deliberate attempt to become a drone power in the same way that Estonia has positioned itself as a cyber power. And so they're really making a big play to do that. They get some very high fidelity data from Ukraine on how different systems perform on the battlefield. They have a very close relationship with Ukrainians perhaps even closer when it comes to sharing certain performance metrics than the United States has with Ukraine on certain issues. And of course, they're right next door, so that positions them really well. And when we were there, I was very impressed by the drone companies, from startups to more mature companies, that are already responding, sending systems to Ukraine. A lot of their executives are in Ukraine themselves and seeing how these things perform firsthand. So Latvia is really positioning itself to set itself up as a drone power, hopefully, which I think will be difficult for a country of their size economically, but I think they can make some really important contributions. And this includes on testing and evaluation. You know, they've set up this really amazing testing area where companies from all over NATO can come test their drone systems in an area that is sort of free from spectrum interference. And they're building a second one, which I think will be the biggest in Europe, if not the biggest in the world, when it comes to testing these kinds of systems. So Latvia is set up to provide a lot of value to the alliance in that sense.
And Zach, that was one of your big takeaways as well, is how Latvia is building up this infrastructure and really seeking to become the center of drone innovation in Europe. What were some of your takeaways there?
No, I mean, I think, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's great to be here on the conversation, and it was great to join the trip. So thank you all for the opportunity. I think when you look at what Latvia is doing, you see a recognition of the situation that they face, the dynamic that that places in terms of their investment, their focus, and how they can drive value. And so what they've really done is build an opportunity for a race to the top, which I think is really important. We've talked a lot about cooperation. We've talked a lot about how do you create shared advantage? How do you create that allied advantage? And we see an opportunity to do that with partners like Latvia, because they're pulling together the academics, industry players, startup entrepreneurs, and they're doing that across borders. So they're bringing in the Ukrainians, they're bringing in NATO partners, and they're helping drive, whether it's testing and evaluation, whether it's rapid procurement like they're driving with the British through the International Drone Coalition. There are real opportunities there to pull people together, test, evaluate, use metrics to drive outcomes, and then ultimately put those drones on contract and push them to where they're needed most. It offers a model, frankly, both in terms of how the US and other large allied powers can think about the way that we integrate innovation at speed of need and get it to the place where it is most required to put that capability to work. I was very impressed at the Latvians' ability to punch above their weight in that realm, and the way that they're setting this up as a competitive nature to make sure that iron is sharpening iron as they drive through this process. So very excited about the potential there, and I think, frankly, it's a big lesson learned for us as we think about our procurement system. I think you saw some of those principles actually reflected yesterday in what NATO put out in their rapid adoption planning that they're trying to drive in terms of new innovative technologies as a procurement focus. And so there's a lot of energy and activity that I think we can take a lot from with the Latvians on the drone dynamic.
And if I could just add, a lot of it has to do with the way their system is organized. So I spoke with one of their undersecretaries at their Ministry of Defense, and he is in charge of industrial policy, force design, and all R&D. So when you have that vested in one office, you can actually get quite a lot done. Whereas, as you know from being in the Defense Department, how many jobs is that split across in our system? And how many different offices and layers of approval and, et cetera, do you have to go through? So there are advantages to being small and lean, which Latvia is, and I think they're going to be able to move faster in some ways because of it.
And it was fascinating, too, the model that, Zach, you just described. One of the things I took away is they're almost, I'll say MacGyvering the model as they go through, is which country that I'm partnered with has the best procurement authority, and I'll use that. Who's putting resources on the table? We have the test infrastructure. Come, bring your kit, we'll test it, get the thumbs up, and then start producing at scale and getting it delivered to the field. I thought that was a bit unique.
Extraordinarily. I mean, I think whether we were talking to the Multinational Detachment North commander, who's a Latvian general, whether we're talking to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the Drone Center, there's a pragmatic optimism, but also a dogged determination to drive outcomes because of this recognition of we have limited budget, we only have so many dollars that we can spend, so many man hours and so many folks that we can throw against the problem. We've got to figure out a way to put the puzzle together so that we can punch above our weight. And I think it's been very impressive to see, frankly, how the Latvians have done that domestically, done that with international partners. And frankly, it offers this very exciting kind of scaled capability, right? You think about Latvia as this forward leading edge, supporting our Ukrainian partners. But at the same time, their connection to the UK offers this almost Goldilocks opportunity, where the UK is just between some of the larger militaries across the NATO alliance. They've already, in their strategic defense review, indicated that they want to push towards a more autonomous, more drone integrated force. That sets an opportunity for us to do testing, evaluation, see how the British find best practices, use those techniques and procedures, in order to inform how we can do that better here in the US. And so this is a virtuous kind of step function that we can drive across the alliance. And I hope that we can identify those opportunities and really put them to work. I think transformation and contact is a great example of how you can begin to pull those pieces into our Department of Defense.
Okay. Well, and Ryan, on the battlefield learning happening, I know your team at War on the Rocks covers this quite a bit. It was just striking to me to hear it reinforced at the Drone Summit that innovation cycle is now down 2 weeks. I think somebody had said something like 40 days. And it's not just the Ukrainians that are adapting, but the Russians that are adapting as well. So how do you look at that?
Well, for me, it's been interesting talking to Army leaders lately and seeing how they're going to position the Army to respond to that and how they're going to try to enable industry to respond to that. And it's not just about saying to industry, you need to do this in 2 weeks now and adapt these, update software, for example, so it's responsive to changes in electronic warfare on the battlefield. But it's about changing the contract vehicles, which that's not how the contracts currently work now. And there's a lot of, just this year, I've done podcasts with General George, Chief of Staff of the Army, and this was a point that he made. We just came out with one yesterday with General Jim Ramey, head of Futures Command. We have one coming out that I've already recorded with General Donahue at U.S. Army Europe, Africa, and they all made these similar points. So there's a stark realization in the senior ranks of the Army that they need to change the way the Army does business with industry to enable this kind of rapid adoption on the battlefield in response to changes. It's not going to be easy, but they're very aware of it and they're making it a big priority.
Well, and so I'm going to now tuck in the private capital component to this as well. And Zach, I thought it was fantastic having you because of that venture, not only the military service that you have, but that venture capital background that you have. So you brought a different lens to this trip. So you spoke at the summit on a technology investor panel. So I'm curious how you approached the drone summit. What specifically were you looking for, and what were some of your key observations with that investor lens?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement in the dual-use ecosystem, right? This technology that plays at both critical national security challenges, but has these opportunities to drive commercial scale. There's a lot of hope in the drone community around applications in both. And how do you drive that convergence? I think one of the things that's made us very excited is the focus on scaled production, both domestically in the US, but also, as we heard at the Drone Summit in Riga, and across so many different national partners. I think from the private capital perspective, what we want to do is solve scalable challenges. We want to put breakthrough technologies that we believe can be platforms. We want to put capital against them, back their founders, help get in the engine room and drive those folks to scale. I think part of our interest was going to Europe to really see, are they thinking about scaled production? Where do they see the opportunities to create value, both for national security challenges and commercial? And then where are the areas that we're missing, right? Are there value pools, whether that be command and control systems, communications, electronic warfare, all of these different subsystems that go into making these these drone systems really work at scale. We wanted to see what we were missing and where there was opportunity. I think, a big takeaway that we've seen is that Europe has so far struggled with the quality and quantity of entrepreneurs in this sector that we've seen in the US. But I think that is rapidly shifting, especially as after this NATO summit, you've seen really, I think it's a high water mark of indication that Europe is getting serious about its future resilience and future defense. And I think you take that together, again, I said allied advantage before, but those two pieces work extraordinarily well. Now we've got our cutting edge entrepreneurs and innovators thinking about these problems. We've got our researchers with the EU Horizons program, and we've also got all of that activity taking place in the US. This is something where we can really lead by addition and be greater than the sum of our parts. So as a private venture capitalists, we're very excited because we see synergies across those markets to both expand, but also find entrepreneurs who are capable of really being two-sport athletes, who can sell to commercial and who can sell to solve national security challenges.
And Kristine, what was your sense on the ground? You mentioned the 5% commitment that the allies made. Now the focus shifts to building that industrial base capacity, expanding defense innovation. So what's your sense of those next steps to put words into action?
These next steps are really where the rubber hits the road. And in many ways, this is going to be challenging. We have at the moment a very fragmented ecosystem transatlantically and across the European partners as well. There is not yet that connective tissue, not only between the old primes, but also among a lot of the young entrepreneurs. But we're seeing that develop. It needs a demand signal. We hear this from everybody across the sector. And that demand signal is coming in these commitments to investment, to the 5% overall. But you need to have places where folks can get together and also to find efficiencies. There's generally often a habit of creating new institutions in order to come to an outcome. And it's not really a moment for institution building anymore. It's a moment for true pragmatism and a clear sense of time pressure. Something we heard about on the trip was the concerns over the reconstitution of the Russian military, or simply to dual approaches, right? Ukraine can continue for a while, but that doesn't mean that Russia is ignoring the eastern flank anymore. In the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of reporting about Russian military bases growing on the Finnish border. This is further north, it's towards the Arctic, but clearly they're not singularly focused on Ukraine. Well, what does that mean? That means there's an urgency across Europe in order to get things done. That urgency is something that we saw in Latvia, and there's an urgency for growth and development also among the industry. We need to bring those two things together. The skepticism clearly exists. You look to the Spain's reluctance to get to the 5% as a perfect example of the fact that not everyone is on board. But the first movers can get together and find the best path. One example that I think is useful to think about, well, what should you do? What is the best path? See what works. So water will come down the hill in the most direct and fastest way. We have to be like that. We don't need to build something in terms of structural integration and then try it and see if it works. And I think these mini-lateral coalitions or coalitions of actors are going to be really important because that allows others to see a path that works and build on it. At the summit, I was talking about NATO and EU cooperation on a panel. And of course, there's a long track record now of formalized documents about what are the areas that NATO and the EU are going to cooperate on. The EU is providing money, loans, and also grants in order to kickstart a lot of this defense spending and industry. It's no longer supposed to be about these institutions, though. It's about getting things up and running and getting the passion behind them. And so I think industry and the financing side is going to be so important to get things moving. People like jumping on board an exciting new thing. And so I think this is the moment where not only the politicians, but industry and private capital and anybody who wants to do something that's exciting should really be on board. And also part of that is that we're seeing a mindset shift across Europe, I think, on what the defense industry is. For such a long time, it was seen as something outdated, frankly, unnecessary. This Cold War, post-Cold War, end of history idea has been incredibly powerful. And so you haven't had the kind of interest in defense innovation as you've had in other areas. Other kinds of apps, other kinds of technological products have been more interesting. But now there's a purpose, and with funding and with an understanding that this isn't taking away from other things that are important, but it's actually inherent to what is going to make a society successful, that is going to be an important part for moving this forward.
Well, and that's a great point. You've all hit on this as well. One of the discussions that we had in the industry forum and has been a discussion I've been having with Europeans is we want to move fast, we want to scale, but there are barriers to being able to do that. So it's the regulatory environment that they operate in, the lengthy and bureaucratic procurement rules. So a lot of this sounds like what we go through, but similar. The contracting, Ryan, that you mentioned, but even loans and financing. And so there was an announcement that they were looking at how do you create more financing tools for dual-use technology for companies that want to work in national security. And it was interesting. I didn't fully appreciate that companies that are seeking finance for dual-use technologies have sometimes hit barriers or even cultural resistance to obtaining funding. So, I mean, that's maybe a question for you, Zach, is do you see a difference or do you see a shift in European thinking on investing in and finance tools for dual-use technology?
Well, it's a great question. And you look at the US ecosystem as a cognate to try to evaluate how did all this excitement kind of pour into dual use? Well, first of all, the government's indicated that they want to transition away from legacy systems. They want to integrate more cutting edge capabilities in order to drive advantage, both through their own resilience, but also on the battlefield if necessary. And that's been reflected in terms of the growth of these non-traditional contract vehicles that accelerate the ability for startups to get on contract. I would argue, and I think Ryan and I have spent many nights talking about this, there's a huge challenge right now with what we say and posture and what we're actually able to do. And I would suggest that we need something almost similar to what Goldwater Nichols did in '86 for changing the joint force and focus on integrated capability. We need to think about that type of legislation to force this pivot from an 11-year requirements fulfillment cycle into a more capability and context-driven organization. General George has already started this process in terms of what he's doing on transformation and contact as an initial kind of experimental phase, and we've been very excited about what that's indicated. But where that can go, I think Congress has a really unique opportunity here to drive leadership. So I'll say that. With that excitement, you've got a capital market stack that's now built in the US that is ready, prepared, and willing to jump in to build out these capabilities. And that's from your later stage, like your credit facilities to do infrastructure and large-scale build-out, all the way down to private equity, where you can integrate in controlling stakes and drive efficiencies in new business, down to the venture capital and risk capital stack, early stage like us at Scout Ventures, up the scale into specialist and hyperscalers like Andreessen, up to the corporate venture capitalists and growth equity investors as you move up the kind of ladder there. All of that matters because it provides bridges of financing to keep these companies moving. And these rapid contracting vehicles matter because they show market validation that the department, the intelligence community, or other customers in the national security space care about that. Our challenge has been that when we look to Europe, that's been slow to form. Now, that's beginning to change. We think the British, the new National Armaments Director, the Strategic Defence Review, Prime Minister Starmer's comments on the defence dividend, we believe that the UK market is moving quickly, aggressively, and driving scale. The Germans just became the fourth largest defense spender in the world, cresting 60 billion anticipated this year. Rheinmetall is driving focus and energy into its market. Even the Danes are spending aggressively to focus on becoming a maritime defense innovation nation. Now, the challenge is going to be how do you thread all those pieces together? Because in the private capital side, what we need to see is both the capital stack, but you need to have confidence that people want to purchase it, they want to scale it, and they want to integrate it. We think that resilience is a recipe for prosperity. If you focus on integrated resilience, you can drive that prosperity across borders with your allies and forge that allied advantage that we've talked about. The challenge is going to be how do different countries focus in Europe on where they can build a portfolio of excellence and work with allies to use their portfolios of excellence to create that shared strength. And that's something where, to Kristine's point, we have seen a little bit of friction in terms of how well the Brits, the Germans, the French want to play together on certain dynamics, whether that's quantum compute or whether that's cloud. I think that is going to be a key focus as we look across both the continent and the alliance in terms of where there's opportunity to drive scale.
Well, I will say you're speaking my language on Goldwater Nichols. I've been thinking about this as well because Goldwater Nichols, it tackled personnel. and we have joint duty assignments, joint credits to get promoted as a result of Goldwater Nichols. It tackled operations, so we joint operations, the job of the work of the joint staff as an integrator, the combatant commands to bring all of the services, capabilities to bear for operational activities. But we didn't tackle acquisition. And so now you have initiatives like JADC2, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control initiative. The first point of integration in the Department of Defense is the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So there has to be another model. So I'm all on board with thinking through what that looks like in this modern era with just the speed at which technology and frankly operational activity goes.
And we've seen a lot of thinking on it, right? I mean, you saw the Commission on PPPE reform, you've seen report after report. I've joked that you get on enough of these panels, it really becomes a group therapy discussion around why can't we change the procurement system. I think the hopeful point here is that Senator Wicker and the Senate Armed Services Committee has started to dig into the policy side of this. We've been very heartened by that. House Armed Services Committee has indicated an interest in this, on driving a more rapid acquisition pathway, changing some of the incentive models, and thinking about both the personnel but the process necessary to drive the outcomes that we know advantage our nation, advantage our economy, advantage our entrepreneurs, and ultimately, most importantly, our warfighters. And so we're hopeful that these pieces come together and it can be an example setter for other partners. But we should look to lessons like the Latvians in terms of, hey, that's a rapid procurement system that works. We should focus on building those types of opportunities into our force structure.
There's, the House Armed Services Committee has the SPEED Act, and Senate Armed Services Committee has the FORGE Act. These will become reconciled somehow and form core parts of the National Defense Authorization Act this year, and they both contain a lot of good stuff in there. And we're going to be running a comparison of the two in Cogs of War, our new defense tech vertical at War on the Rocks. But on the capital stack issue, I just want to raise one thing that a lot of people don't understand. I know Zach understands it, but there's still this missing piece when it comes to debt and credit. That's very hard to get here in the US if you're an early stage or even beyond early stage defense company or dual use company. If you just won, let's say you're a new company and you just won this big contract from the Army, you cannot go to a bank and get a loan based off that because it's a defense contract. And so we've only just started seeing the emergence of firms like Leonid, for example, which will exclusively give debt vehicles to early stage dual use and defense tech companies. And that's really important because you might not be able to raise venture funding or you might not want to give away equity in your company. And so there needs to be these other options in the form of loans. I don't think Europe has any of that yet, and we're just starting to figure that out for the earlier stage companies, and that's a real missing piece of the puzzle.
That's a really great point. Well, if I can also put the two of you on the spot as well, we haven't talked about hybrid warfare yet, and we had the opportunity to visit a few military bases when we were out in Latvia, Adazi, which is where the NATO headquarters for Multinational Division North, and then Lielvārde Air Base, where there was a U.S. aviation task force station. So I want to ask the both of you what stood out from those, I'll say, military deep dives at a more operational and tactical level, what they're seeing and what you observed in terms of Russian hybrid warfare activity, hybrid and conventional, the nexus between hybrid and conventional warfare. But what are we on the U.S. side gaining from that, Ryan? You mentioned a bit of some of the things that the Army is doing differently. What did you observe, and what are we taking away?
Well, for me, the way I think of it more is through the lens of what are the likely contingencies if you're looking at the Baltic states and Russia wants to do something, let's say. What we often are preparing for is that high end. Like Russia's going to come in like they did in Ukraine with armored columns and tanks. Probably they've hopefully, not hopefully for them, but they probably learned some lessons from how they screwed up the initial invasion, and they would send in more troops. But we're preparing for that. Whereas I think the more difficult scenarios are, what do you do if Russia comes in and takes like 20 yards of territory and then stops and dares NATO to escalate on the basis of, it's like, what, are you going to start a nuclear war for 20 yards? It's those sort of edge cases that I think where hybrid war scenarios come in, and you have a lot of concerns in all the Baltic countries about subversion and penetration of institutions, the use of criminal gangs by Russia to launch acts of sabotage. There's been, they told us about at least one example in Latvia of Russia using a criminal to launch a violent attack on a museum, for example. And you can imagine these things scaling up. And then the question becomes, how do you use military force and NATO to respond to that? And that's where, this is not a new question. This is something that we've been debating about for a very long time, and I still don't think we have very good answers to that.
I'd say there's two things that I walked away with from those visits. The first is that persistent presence matters. When we talk to M&D North, when we talk to the folks at the Air Force facility, the presence of U.S. forces was absolutely essential to both their confidence, their training, and their ability to drive the outcomes and the force posture that they wanted to. And that didn't mean that U.S. forces were running that base or telling them what to do, but they were working shoulder to shoulder with them to drive outcomes that they knew were in their shared interest. And you look across the world, and those areas where we've had that persistent presence, we've been able to build trust. And at the end of the day, no matter what training you have, it falls back down to trust. And one of the things that really shone through in every conversation that we had, both with the American personnel who were deployed forward there, representing our country and doing it well, and our Latvian partners and multinational partners that were there, was it matters that the Americans are here, both from a training perspective, both from a confidence perspective, but ultimately, again, back down to that trust perspective. Second fact of that is that is actually a great leading indicator for us to see what some of these best practices are that our partners are out there doing. And I would take it back even a step further into the Drone Summit, and sorry to take it back to that, but what are the youth doing and what are they excited about? Kristine mentioned this before around, are you really seeing this energy in Europe? I could definitely tell you that in Latvia, I was blown away by the focus on this particular sector as an area of interest. And I think it speaks to both the national zeitgeist at this moment and the challenge that they're facing, but the hope for the future. At the Drone Summit, there was a large class on how to put together your own drone. And it was oversubscribed. They had more folks in the event than they could handle. And it was all Latvian youth. That evening, I had an opportunity to speak at Startup House Riga, and it was standing room only for folks that were either entrepreneurs or wanted to become entrepreneurs in the dual use space. And that's a pretty inspiring thing to see, because it helps you realize that we can be part of catalyzing that there is prosperity that can be unlocked here. I think it's important to remember that Google started with a DARPA contract, the internet started as a DARPA project. Launch was an effort supported by NASA that was culminated through SpaceX and Blue Origin. So you think about these incredible commercial applications that we have of these technologies that make a whole new world possible. They started with national security priorities. And so if we can get folks excited about their resilience, their safety, their security, we can build prosperity off the back of that. And I think Latvia is beginning to do that. I'm excited to see where that can go.
It's funny, I listened to some of the panels, but I spent a lot of time talking to those kids and watching them hands-on, young boys and girls building drones out of kits. I would almost challenge our defense conferences here throughout the next year is create a format where you bring in kids to build drones, build small satellites, actually build some of these things and get them excited about the tech.
And think about the problem solving that this can offer, right? Yeah. Because so maybe you offer them a class on a drone. The exciting part is, what is that kid going to think about how you can apply that somewhere else to some other great benefit? And I think that's the hope, that's the kind of dual use dividend that we try to push for, is you can find these opportunities that unleash creativity and even better outcomes.
And so this is a good segue back to you, Kristine, because I want to touch on the societal resilience piece. When we talked about how the military is countering this hybrid warfare, some of the misinformation, but there's also things that Latvia is doing, I think, which is really innovative in their thinking on how do you build societal resistance, how do you involve businesses in pushing back on some of these activities. And you took several of us to the Occupation Museum, which is very, very sobering and enlightening, but there are times in history where the Latvian, the business and civil society has risen up to push back. I think there's things for Taiwan or others to perhaps learn from what the Baltic nations are doing there. So do you mind just touching on that for a moment?
Absolutely. So the Baltic states weren't passive during the years of occupation during the Soviet Union. There was active resistance in the forests into the 50s. But then when you look at the track to independence, there was a lot of mobilization, human chain, from between all the Baltic capitals on the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There were large marches with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And so the notion of agency and responsibility is incredibly strong. And so that's why you think you see leadership from the Baltic states and from Latvia on a lot of these issues. So how does that work today? There's a very active National Guard that is an intrinsic part of defense planning, but you also have exercises and engagement with municipalities, with regional government, and with private industry to get society thinking about their role in defense. It creates a sense of agency and responsibility. So there are annual exercises that aren't just something that happens on a base that you hear about or are disrupted with because you can't drive on the highway when there are troops moving around, but instead there is the involvement here of, well, what does a city do? What does a region do? What does a private individual do in these circumstances? And there's a question more broadly that was being posed at the summit and around the summit, the drone summit, which is, what is a defense company today? What is the creativity that we can use to think about, well, what is each tech company's role, potential contribution they can make in the defense field? What are other areas infrastructure companies doing so that they're also part of this bigger picture? Further in the Nordics, there's total defense approaches or comprehensive security as they approach it. But seeing this in a small country where you need to have all hands on decks, I think is very inspiring. And there's a lot that the US can be learning and other allies in terms of societal cohesion, in terms of service and a mentality of service that I think is really helpful because it has been incredibly successful to stand up for yourself. The idea that the true vulnerability will come, as Ryan was saying, not because you suddenly have 500,000 troops amassed on the borders, but because a series of things go wrong, because people didn't say something, stand up, call it out, be protecting themselves. I think that's a far bigger risk. And that's where, again, that individual responsibility and responsibility across different layers and levels of government and also industry comes in.
Yeah, that's a really great point. There are several fantastic audience questions here, so I'm going to get to a few. And I would encourage others, if you have them, if any of the discussion has triggered additional thoughts, please go ahead and submit those. So I'll throw this out to Ryan, but ask any of you to jump in. So you've emphasized the value of practitioner insights. How can NATO better institutionalize battlefield learning, especially from Ukraine and the Baltics, into their training, doctrine, and defense procurement? But I would say not just NATO, how does the United States internalize or institutionalize that battlefield learning? And you touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, so there are a lot of efforts to do this, and there's a lot of learning happening. There's Ukrainians that are sent to NATO installations to participate in training. There's obviously a lot of close coordination between the United States and NATO on lots of the United States and Ukraine on lots of things. The biggest limitation, however, is the lack of battlefield observers. So if you don't have people on the ground that are military professionals who understand how to assess things, that are just watching what's happening, there's a limitation to what you're going to learn because things do change very quickly. And there's this great ecosystem of military analysts like our friend Michael Kaufman who go to Ukraine every quarter and help deliver some lessons. But I think it was a real missed opportunity that we didn't invest in something more focused on actually having observers, not advisors, not people participating in conflict, but observers in the country. I think that's limited the kind of learning that we have been able to do. Now, having said that, the Army, the Marine Corps have major lessons learned efforts, and they are doing their best to institute them. A lot of that has happened at Futures Command, a lot of it has happened at NATO itself and U.S. Army Europe. I can't get too much more into it, but there has been, I would say listen to the forthcoming episode that we have with General Donahue, which will be coming out in about a week or two.
Okay. Well, and then for the private sector, one of the observations in Ukraine is they have some of their companies embedded with their operational units, and they're making changes and adapting, whether it be the technology itself or their tactics, almost on the fly.
It's true, and it's hard for me to assess how successful they're being, and I'm not calling out any specific company here, but I talked to a lot of them, and they all say the same thing. Our stuff's working great. Every other company's stuff is crap and it's failing. So I don't know what's actually happening. I'm not there. But I do think it'll be interesting once we have more data, time goes on, we're able to look back and things are less tied to marketing and the commercial interest at the moment to see what happens.
I'd say even in space, though, you look at Starlink I envision, and I guess I'm speculating here because I don't know this for a fact, but as Starlink has experienced attempts at jamming the communication signal, I can envision that there's an operations center somewhere. It's probably virtual in this day and age, but operators sitting next to software engineers that are making modifications to the software and the performance of those signals almost on the fly to be able to quickly adapt. I envision in our traditional DoD system, it would be weeks to get an engineering change proposal through to actually make those changes. So I think there is some learning on just how quickly that cycle needs to evolve to adapt to what's happening on the battlefield.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's innovation at the speed of battle that we're seeing in Ukraine, and the effects that the Ukrainians have been able to drive to take asymmetries that are on their face weaknesses and turn them into extraordinary advantages have been nothing short of historic. I mean, whether it's been in the maritime space, whether it's been in the drone space, whether it's been in countering on the EW space, it's been incredible to watch them quite literally develop, productize, iterate, and deploy at speed of need and at speed of battle. And that capability is really almost unmatched anywhere else in the world. And you've seen some opportunities of where the U.S. Has integrated these learnings. One of the first transformation and contact iterations down at the Joint Readiness Training Center just occurred with the 101st. National Training Center out in California with the Army 2nd ACR, 2nd Cav, did an iteration with drones as a major component for their preparations around large-scale conflict. So we know that the DoD is planning, but it's, again, a question of speed, relevancy of insight, and how do you drive that. And again, that's why, back to the point Ryan was making, having that kind of forward observer perspective, or even just the ability to meet in a common way through persistent presence, that's why that matters throughout the world, because if we're not talking about Ukraine, we can also think about risk vectors in different places all throughout the world. Part of the reason Iraqi special operations were so successful against ISIS during the 2010s was purely because they were working and collaborating and had persistent presence from the U.S. Special Operations community. So we have best practices. We just need to think about how we scale those out across different force structures.
And part of lessons are also understanding where they might not apply to us.
Yeah.
So it's not just about taking what Ukraine's doing and doing that. We will fight if such a war happens, and we all hope it doesn't, but whether it's against Russia or China or someone else, Iran tonight, who knows? We will fight differently, and because we're organized differently. We'll have an air force that will hopefully be playing a much more significant role in the conflict than Ukraine's is able to do. And we will employ drones differently than Ukraine is doing at the front. So we published an article today by a volunteer who fought for the Ukrainians, and he takes sort of a dim view of FPV drones and their use at the front while he was out there. And I read a lot of them. It's like, oh, this is actually really interesting, but it's a really interesting critique of how these weapon systems are being used. But it's also a critique that applies to a specific place and time, because when the U.S. employs these systems, they will be employing them in very different ways. And so it's understanding how a U.S. Army unit might use something, and what can we take and learn from the Ukrainians, and what can we not. I think some of the most interesting lessons from the Ukrainians are less about that and more about resilience and their ability to galvanize industry and other things.
And realign industry, I think, right? Like very quickly drive that integration in a way that is pretty historic in terms of need. Sorry.
Yeah, no, because this dovetails well with a couple of questions that I will bundle here, which is more along the lines of, so what capabilities pair well with drones? And when you look at the overall European security picture, where are there gaps in European military readiness? So what are some of the areas, this also ties back to the NATO summit and the 5%, what are the areas of capability that we need to see the Europeans invest in, maybe areas that the US has been carrying the weight on to some degree that can be complementary to drones or address other security needs?
Yeah, I don't say this to insult our European allies and friends, but when it comes to gaps and capabilities, we'd have to have a whole event devoted to that. Unfortunately,
I was going to ask, how much time do we have?
Yeah. And they realize that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the even though it was an emotionally raw moment in transatlantic relations, I think one of the useful things that came out of the disastrous meeting between Trump and Zelensky in the White House earlier in the year was this Europe being shaken and saying, like, actually, we do need to develop some of these capabilities for ourselves. We can't just rely on the U.S. to, for example, provide high-level ISR, to provide all the depth when it comes to logistics, all this other stuff. And so there are a lot of gaps. A lot of them don't really relate to drones, I would say. It comes to delivering a lot more traditional military power, having enough spare parts for their tanks in Germany, for example, or so on and so forth. But I'm encouraged by what we've seen out of the NATO forum, the NATO summit that just concluded. It certainly could have gone much worse, and it didn't. But let's also keep in mind the 2015, I believe, was the Wales Summit pledge for 2%, and there's still plenty of countries that don't meet 2% GDP. We're talking about 5% now. 1.5% of that is supposed to be in defense-related infrastructure. How that gets counted and included is still an open debate, and I think there's going to be, unfortunately, a lot of accounting shell games when it comes to that. So I'm still waiting to see if the Europeans rise to the moment, but I'm encouraged by the direction.
I mean, I think I would encourage us to focus on the strengths, right? So, I mean, my personal favorite anecdote about some of the weaknesses is the French committed troops to support in Poland in order to bolster the Eastern Front against Russia shortly after the invasion, but they demanded that the Americans drive their troops to Poland. So now, whether that anecdote is true, it comes from a friend at NATO, but we'll see. The real story, I think, is how do you focus on the strengths? How do you lean into those? How do you invest in those? And then again, how do you create these shared centers of excellence? So if the Danes are going all in on maritime defense innovation, how do you support and make sure that they are uniquely placed to support across Scandinavia to do that? How do you support the Brits and what they're doing in terms of Dark Shroud, which is one of their very effective collaborative combat aircraft programs that's already fielded its first prototype and is driving to scale. The Germans with manufacturing and Rheinmetall, the Italians with shipbuilding. There is real opportunity to focus, drive excellence, and build innovation ecosystems around these existing primes that are already delivering at scale, and in many cases provide capability through their U.S. subsidiaries to our Department of Defense. So yes, there are a number of weaknesses, and I think we can definitely have a good laugh about where some of those are most glaring. But I do think that for right now, the big focus needs to be on, if you want to get up the curve, how do you build an innovation ecosystem around your centers of excellence?
Well, I look at a few areas, and I know NATO is already starting to go down this path, but a big implication of drones, it's not just how do you effectively employ them, but how do you defend against them? So the counter-drone technology coming out of the ecosystem, much more emphasis on air defenses. I mean, we saw in Iran what happened when your air defenses are down, obviously. Integrating drones into a more rapid ISR and targeting cycle. I think that, Ryan, to your point, that's been something that the U.S. has been, that Ukraine has relied heavily on the U.S. for, but how do you get the Europeans also to improve there? And then you mentioned it already, which is the sustainment and logistics piece. So yeah, not just relying on the U.S. to get you from point A to point B. We're running low on time here, so I thought maybe I'd just do an around the table here, last thoughts. And I think, when we went into the trip in Latvia and then even into the NATO summit, we went into this with a lot of headwinds, with the U.S. new administration commit to NATO, what is the state of European security in Ukraine, and with the U.S. commit there, the greater burden sharing demands, likely U.S. force posture changes, potential reductions. Can the industrial base build up capacity quickly enough? So, after the study tour in Latvia, after the NATO summit yesterday, maybe any big takeaways, last thoughts, big ideas that you'd want to seed with policymakers, coming out of the last couple of weeks. So I don't know if one. Kristine, do I put you on the spot? I'll put you on the spot first.
You can put me on the
That's a
spot
lot.
first. I think there's an element of forward deployment and experimentation that needs to happen. This is something that is coming from the study tour, but there is a desire to plan out a perfect system and then implement it, as opposed to feeling free to experiment with various technologies. The more stuff we have in the air when it comes to drone technology, the more things that are available for any country to fight with, the greater the deterrent effect is. And so rather than a single prestige system, rather than something that is perfect and exceptional, having a great diversity of tools available is going to be an asset in the immediate term. That's maybe not exactly how things should work in a perfect world, but the challenge in Europe is to show deterrence and a growth path now that is not simply about projected budget allocations. So how do we create a messy but unpredictable and therefore prickly system across Europe that is going to already deliver what is essential right now, which is deterrence, and build towards that really strong defense capability in the next few years? And that immediate benefit question isn't always on top of mind. It's nice to think about 2035. What are we thinking about 2026 and 2027 and 2028? And a lot of the things that we have, even if they're off the shelf and even if they're coming down the line, those are 2026 and 2027 deliveries. So much of that information is public that the adversaries certainly know about that too. So what is prickly, what is tough, and what is complicated right now from an adversary's perspective? And let's get that to be the engine to build those bigger, greater things with the money and with the political appetite that will come with it.
I have nothing really to add. I just want to say thanks to Kristine and the German Marshall Fund for including me on the trip, and thanks to you and CSIS for inviting me here today.
It's been a privilege. This has been great. My final thoughts are a little bit kind of similar to what Kristine has said, which is, the old adage goes, best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, the next best time is today. Mm-hmm. I think Europeans have an opportunity here to not just think about the way to drive towards a baseline, but actually leapfrog capability and opportunity. And so instead of focusing on mimicking exactly what other partners have done, there needs to be an opportunity to focus on innovation. There needs to be a focus on driving capability, and remembering that a good capability fielded today, developed, iterated, and deployed is better than a perfect solution next week. And so all those pieces, I think, present opportunity. You have capital aligning to it, and most importantly, you have talent aligning to it. The European governments need to think about that as they field, they purchase, they deploy, and they experiment. And so if we can figure that out here, the Europeans can figure it out there, the alliance will be much better for it.
That's a great point, and that's what resonated with me too, is you have the leadership there, you have agency, there are a bunch of tools in the toolkit that exist today. So resource paired with the right contract vehicle or procurement authority, paired with the right testing environment, whatever, you can put those things together, best of breed, you can really get a lot done in the near term as opposed to waiting for perfect. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you all. I thought that was a great takeaway from our trip there. So audience, I want to thank you for joining us today. This was a fantastic discussion. Kristine and German Marshall Fund, thank you for hosting us on this fantastic study tour. Safe travels back from NATO. Ryan, Zach, thanks so much for joining today. And just lastly, I want to thank our CSIS streaming and broadcasting team and Chase Harward for all of their support in making the discussion happen. Thank you.